She was not a general, not a politician, not a bureaucrat. She had no formal title in the Third Reich, no office in the Reich Chancellery, no seat at the conference tables where Europe's fate was decided. And yet, Emmy Göring spent more than a decade at the very center of the Nazi world, presiding over state banquets, hosting foreign dignitaries, collecting stolen art, and calling herself, without apparent irony, the First Lady of the Third Reich. She lived in a fairy tale fantasy of power and luxury, while her husband directed the systematic looting of an entire continent. She watched the war come, watched it unfold, and watched it consume everything around her. And when the curtain fell on the Third Reich in 1945, she faced a reckoning of her own. So what did Emmy Göring actually do all day? How did a divorced actress from Hamburg become the second most powerful woman in Hitler's Germany? What did she know? What did she choose to ignore, and what did she spend the rest of her very long life telling herself about it? In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning in the city of Hamburg, long before anyone had heard of Hermann Göring. Emmy Johanna Sonnemann was born on March 24, 1893 in Hamburg, the daughter of Karl Ernst Sonnemann, a prosperous merchant, and his wife, Ida Gödecke. The family was comfortably bourgeois, respectable and financially stable, and Emmy's early life was marked by the kind of provincial security that made it easy to dream of something grander. She was a bright, attractive and ambitious young woman, and by her teenage years she had fixed her sights firmly on a career in the theatre. This was not a typical aspiration for a merchant's daughter in Wilhelmina, Germany, where respectability still demanded a certain conformity, but Emmy possessed both the talent and the stubbornness to pursue it. She trained as an actress and began building a career that would take her to stages across Germany, first in smaller repertory theatres and eventually to larger companies in Weimar and elsewhere. She was not a star of the first magnitude, not a figure who commanded headlines or packed out grand opera houses, but she was a competent and respected professional who earned a steady living doing work she loved. Her personal life was more turbulent. In 1916, during the upheaval of the First World War, Emmy married actor Karl Köstlin, a union that seemed at the time to offer both romantic fulfillment and professional companionship. Two people of the theatre building a life together in difficult times. But the marriage did not last. The couple divorced in 1935, and Emmy found herself at 42, unmarried, still working, and about to walk into the most consequential encounter of her life. At this point, the question is not just what Emmy Göring did all day, but who she was before she became Emmy Göring at all. And the answer is that she was a professional woman who had navigated a competitive industry on her own terms for more than 2 decades. She was not naive. She was not sheltered. She was not someone who stumbled into the world of the Third Reich without the capacity to understand what she was seeing. That matters enormously for everything that comes after. Emmy had been working at the National Theatre in Weimar since 1919, and it was there, in the early 1930s, that she first encountered Hermann Göring. Göring was by this point already one of the most powerful men in Germany, a war hero decorated with the Pour le Mérite, a founding figure of the Nazi Party, and since January 1933 the President of the Reichstag and the Minister President of Prussia. He was broad, loud, theatrical, and utterly magnetic in his way. A man who loved grand gestures, expensive uniforms, and the company of performers and artists. He adored the theatre and attended it frequently, and it was at a performance in Weimar that he first saw Emmy on stage. He was immediately captivated. He began attending her performances repeatedly, sending flowers and notes backstage, pursuing her with the same relentless determination he brought to everything else in his life. Emmy was cautious at first, perhaps understandably wary of a man of his political prominence, but Göring was persistent, and gradually the relationship deepened into something genuine. By the time they were seen publicly together in 1934, there was little doubt about where this was heading. Hermann Göring had been married before. His first wife, Karin von Kantzau, a Swedish noblewoman, had captured his heart in the early 1920s, and their marriage had been a passionate one. Karin was a committed believer in National Socialism, a woman who shared Göring's political obsessions as well as his personal ones. She had died in October 1931 after years of serious illness, and Göring had mourned her with a fervour that bordered on the operatic. He built a vast hunting estate northeast of Berlin and named it Hall in her memory, a monument in carved timber and stone to the woman he claimed to love above all others. That he was now pursuing a relationship with a divorced actress from Hamburg did not trouble him in the least. Göring was not a man who allowed sentiment to interfere with appetite, and by 1934 his appetite had settled decisively on Emmy Sonnemann. The wedding took place on April 10th, 1935, in Berlin, and it was a spectacle on a scale that even the Nazis, not known for their understatement, found remarkable. Göring was by now not merely a minister, but one of the 3 or 4 most powerful men in Germany, and the event was planned accordingly. Adolf Hitler himself acted as best man. The ceremony was preceded by a military parade. Luftwaffe aircraft flew over Berlin in formation. 12,000 members of the police force and various Nazi organizations lined the streets. The reception was held at the State Opera, and the guest list included the cream of German political and military life. For Emmy, this was not simply a wedding. It was a coronation. One day she had been a respected but not especially prominent actress in Weimar. The next she was the wife of the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, the president of the Reichstag, and the master of the German hunt. What exactly did that mean in practical terms? What did Emmy Göring actually do all day once she had become Emmy Göring? The answer begins with the houses. The number and grandeur of the Göring residences was staggering even by the standards of the Third Reich's leadership, a class of men not given to modest living. Hermann Göring occupied multiple properties simultaneously, each staffed with servants, decorated at enormous expense and maintained regardless of cost. There was the palatial official residence in Berlin on Leipziger Strasse, which had been refurbished and expanded to suit Göring's tastes at public expense. There was Karenhall, the hunting estate in the Schorfheide forest northeast of Berlin, which Göring continuously expanded throughout the 1930s and 1940s until it had grown into something approaching a private palace, complete with a vast art gallery, a model railway that Göring played with like an enormous child, a zoo of exotic animals, and facilities for the hunting parties that Göring hosted for foreign dignitaries and Nazi colleagues alike. There was a mountain villa at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden, close to Hitler's own Berghof. There was a hunting lodge in Romanton Heath in East Prussia. There were other properties scattered across the territories that Germany had annexed or conquered. Emmy had to manage, or at least preside over, this empire of real estate, and managing it was itself a full-time occupation. The staff at each of these properties was considerable. Karenhall alone employed dozens of servants, groundskeepers, gamekeepers, cooks, valets, and secretaries. Emmy's day typically began with consultations with household staff about the day's requirements, whether for a formal dinner, a hunting party, a reception for foreign visitors, or simply the maintenance of domestic life on the scale at which the Görings operated. She oversaw menus, managed the social calendar, handled the correspondence that related to her own engagements, and dealt with the constant stream of visitors, petitioners and well-wishers who presented themselves at the door of a house that was simultaneously a private home, and one of the most important nodes in the social network of the Nazi state. Emmy took this role seriously. She was not merely decorative, she was an active manager of what was in effect a small court. The social obligations were immense and unceasing. As the wife of the second most powerful man in Germany, Emmy was expected to attend, and often to host, a continuous round of state functions, party events, diplomatic receptions, theatre and opera performances, military ceremonies and private gatherings of the Nazi elite. She was present at the great theatrical moments of the Third Reich's public life, the Nuremberg rallies, the Olympic Games of 1936, the parade of foreign visitors who came to pay their respects to the new Germany. She dressed for these occasions with care and considerable expense, wearing the kind of gowns that the Nazi leadership both affected to despise, as manifestations of bourgeois decadence, and simultaneously demanded of their wives as symbols of German prosperity and taste. Emmy navigated this contradiction without apparent difficulty. She liked beautiful clothes, beautiful surroundings, and beautiful things, and she surrounded herself with all three without apparent qualm. But the role that Emmy seems to have relished most, the one that gave her the clearest sense of her own identity and importance in the Nazi world, was the role of hostess. She organised and presided over the state dinners at which Göring entertained foreign leaders, ambassadors, industrialists, and military figures. These were not small affairs. A dinner at the Göring residence or at Hall might include dozens of guests, elaborate multi-course meals prepared by professional chefs, wines of the finest quality, entertainment by leading musicians or performers, and the kind of sustained social performance that required genuine skill to orchestrate. Emmy was good at this. Her years in the theatre had taught her how to manage an audience, how to move through a room, how to put people at ease and make them feel that they were the most important person in her world at that particular moment. She deployed these skills in service of her husband's political and diplomatic ambitions, and she did it with considerable effectiveness. Among the guests who passed through the Göring household were some of the most significant figures of the era: foreign ministers and heads of state, military commanders from allied and neutral nations, industrialists whose cooperation Göring needed for his rearmament program, artists and performers whom Göring wished to patronize or impress. Emmy presided over all of them. She spoke intelligently about art, about theatre, about music. She was genuinely knowledgeable about these subjects, not merely performing knowledge, and this made her a more effective hostess than many of her counterparts among the Nazi wives. She could hold a conversation with a Swedish diplomat or an Italian general or a French art dealer on something like equal terms, and this was both socially useful and personally gratifying to her. She had built a life in the theatre on her own intelligence and talent, and now she applied those same qualities to a very different stage. Yet Emmy's role as hostess brought her into the territory that would define her historical legacy and her post-war difficulties. The dinners she organised, the receptions she presided over, the relationships she facilitated, all took place against a backdrop of systematic crime. The art that decorated the walls of Hall and the Berlin residence was not purchased honestly. It was looted, confiscated from Jewish collectors and dealers who had been stripped of their property under the Nuremberg laws and subsequent measures, or seized from occupied territories across Europe. The beautiful objects that surrounded Emmy Göring in her daily life, the paintings, the sculptures, the tapestries, the silver, the fine furniture, were the material fruits of a program of cultural theft on a scale Europe had never seen. Did Emmy know this? Did she ask where the art came from? Did she wonder why priceless works that had belonged to respected Jewish families in Frankfurt or Amsterdam were now hanging on the walls of Hall? The historical record does not provide a clear answer to these questions, but it provides enough evidence to make certain conclusions unavoidable. Emmy Göring was not stupid, and she was not uninformed. She lived at the centre of the Nazi world. She heard the conversations. She saw the confiscations. She lived in houses filled with property that had belonged to others. She cannot have failed to understand, at least in general terms, what was happening around her. Whether she engaged with this knowledge at a moral level, whether she ever lay awake at night confronting the source of her comfort and security, is something only she could know. What we know is what she did. She continued to live in those houses, to wear those jewels, to preside over those dinner tables, and to describe herself as the First Lady of the Third Reich. That self-description was itself a source of considerable friction within the Nazi hierarchy, and it points to one of the more revealing aspects of Emmy's character and her role in the regime. Emmy Göring was not the only woman who might have claimed the title of First Lady. There was, of course, Eva Braun, Hitler's long-standing companion who was kept almost entirely out of public view before the very end of the war. Eva was the woman closest to the Führer, but she occupied no public role and was unknown to most Germans until 1945. This created a vacuum that Emmy, as the wife of the second most powerful man in Germany, and a woman with a professional background in public performance, was very willing to fill. She hosted state functions in Hitler's name. She played the gracious consort at diplomatic events. She positioned herself as the social centre of the Third Reich's leadership class. And she was very good at it. Hitler, initially at least, seems to have tolerated and even appreciated Emmy's social function. She was charming, presentable, and effective, and the elaborate hospitality she organised at the Göring residences served a genuine diplomatic purpose. But Emmy made a crucial error. She treated Eva Braun not merely with competitive coolness, but with open contempt. She referred to Eva dismissively, excluded her from social events, and made clear in various ways that she regarded Göring's wife as the appropriate social superior to the Führer's unacknowledged companion. Eva was furious, and Hitler was not pleased. He demanded that Göring instruct Emmy to treat Eva with proper respect. Emmy was then excluded from the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat, for a period, a social and political humiliation that was felt acutely in a world where access to the Führer was the supreme currency of power. Emmy's disdain for Eva Braun was one of the few instances in which her social instincts seemed to have failed her entirely, and it illustrated the peculiar politics of femininity at the top of the Nazi state. The birth of Emmy's daughter, Edda, on June 2, 1938, was another moment of Göring theatrical excess. Hermann Göring ordered 500 Luftwaffe aircraft to fly in formation over Berlin, to mark the occasion, telling anyone who would listen that he would have doubled the number had the child been a boy. Edda was the couple's only child, a late arrival for Emmy at 45, and she was doted on with a ferocity that was both touching and revealing. Göring showered his daughter with gifts and attention, and among the gifts were items of considerable historical significance, paintings, jewels, and objects of art that would later become the subject of prolonged legal disputes about their true ownership. Edda grew up surrounded by beauty and luxury at Karinhall, photographed frequently for the Nazi press as a symbol of the healthy, wholesome family life that the regime liked to project to the German public. Emmy was at the centre of this domestic performance, a devoted and attentive mother who seems to have genuinely loved her daughter deeply in a world of calculation and performance that love appears to have been real. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s and the war began in earnest, the texture of Emmy's daily life changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. The great diplomatic receptions continued, but their character shifted. The foreign guests now came not as potential partners to be courted, but as allies to be managed or neutralised, and the events that Emmy organised served increasingly explicit political purposes. The looting of occupied Europe was now proceeding at industrial scale, and Göring was its chief architect. He had established a special organisation, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, and worked alongside it with his own agents to strip museums, private collections, and cultural institutions across France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, and the Soviet Union of their most valuable contents. Trainloads of art, furniture, wine, textiles, and precious objects rolled eastward toward Germany, much of it destined for Karinhall. Emmy was present as this treasure accumulated. She was there when the paintings arrived, when the sculptures were installed, when the tapestries were hung on the walls of the great halls. She entertained guests in rooms whose contents represented the cultural heritage of subjugated nations and the stolen property of persecuted peoples. Whatever she told herself about the provenance of these things, whatever mental barrier she maintained between the world of dinner parties and the world of confiscation and deportation, she was physically present in the material evidence of her husband's crimes every single day. This is one of the most difficult aspects of Emmy Göring's story. She was not a perpetrator in any direct sense. She gave no orders, she ran no camps, she signed no deportation lists, but she was a beneficiary of the system in the most intimate and immediate possible way, and she does not appear to have found this troubling enough to act on. The war brought other changes to Emmy's daily routine. As Germany's military situation deteriorated after the disasters at Stalingrad in early 1943 and the mounting Allied bombing campaign thereafter, the atmosphere of triumph and celebration that had characterized the early war years gave way to something more anxious and defensive. Göring had promised the German people that the Luftwaffe would protect them from bombing, a promise he was catastrophically unable to keep, and his standing with Hitler declined sharply as the British and American air forces began systematically destroying German cities. The grand social occasions became less frequent, or at least less publicly prominent. Karinhall remained a refuge and continued to operate on its extraordinary scale, but the world outside its walls was growing darker and more dangerous. Emmy continued her domestic and social duties throughout these years, managing the household, overseeing her daughter's upbringing, attending the performances and events that still continued despite the war, and maintaining the social connections that were both personally meaningful to her and politically useful to her husband. She was by temperament an optimist, or perhaps more precisely, a person who preferred not to look too closely at the things that might disturb her optimism. Accounts of her from this period consistently describe her as warm, gracious, and apparently contented, a woman who had found the life she wanted and was determined to enjoy it, regardless of what was happening beyond the walls of her magnificent homes. But the walls were closing in. By early 1945, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and Anglo-American forces from the west, even Emmy's considerable capacity for selective attention could not entirely screen out the reality that the Third Reich was collapsing. In February 1945, the Görings began the process of evacuating Carenhall, removing the most valuable pieces of art and sending them south toward Bavaria by truck and train, a desperate effort to preserve at least part of what had been accumulated over more than a decade. Emmy and Edda relocated to the family's villa at Obersalzberg, near Berchtesgaden, one of the last safe places in a rapidly shrinking Reich. Hermann Göring himself was engaged in his final political maneuvers, attempting to assume leadership of Germany as Hitler withdrew into the Berlin bunker, an effort that would end with his arrest on Hitler's orders and a charge of treason that stripped him of all his offices and came close to resulting in his execution at SS hands, before the end of the war. Emmy was at Obersalzberg when American forces arrived in the spring of 1945. She was with her daughter surrounded by what remained of the Göring household when the world she had inhabited for a decade finally, definitively ended. Hermann Göring had by this point surrendered to American forces and was being transported to Nuremberg, where the greatest war crimes trial in history was being prepared. Emmy's life as the First Lady of the Third Reich was over. What remained was the reckoning. And for Emmy Göring, the reckoning would take many forms: legal, financial, social, personal, and historical. To understand what Emmy faced in the immediate aftermath of the war, it is necessary to understand what kind of woman she was and what kind of world she had lived in. She was 52 years old in 1945, in good health, possessed of considerable intelligence and social skill, and utterly bereft of any power base, independent of her husband. Everything she had, every comfort she enjoyed, every identity she had built over the previous decade derived directly from her relationship with Hermann Göring. The Göring name, which had opened every door in Germany and much of occupied Europe, was now a burden of a different kind entirely. The American and British officers who arrived in Bavaria in the spring of 1945 knew exactly who Emmy Göring was, and they were not interested in her warmth or her skill as a hostess. Emmy's arrest came quickly. She was detained by American forces in May 1945 at Obersalzberg, along with her daughter Edda. The immediate experience was humiliating and disorienting for a woman who had spent years surrounded by deference and luxury. She was held for interrogation, questioned about her husband's activities, about the art collection, about the financial arrangements that had sustained the Göring Empire, about who she had met and what she had known. Emmy was cooperative up to a point, but her fundamental strategy throughout the post-war process was consistent and never really wavered. She presented herself as a wife, a mother, and an actress who had supported her husband without any detailed knowledge of or involvement in his official activities. She knew about the dinner parties. She knew about the houses and the art. She did not know, she insisted, about the crimes. This was a position she would maintain for the rest of her life, and it was neither entirely false nor entirely true. Emmy was not Hermann Göring. She had not planned the looting of occupied Europe. She had not ordered the persecution of Jews. She had not commanded the bombing of Rotterdam or Warsaw. But she had lived at the center of the system that did all these things, had benefited from it materially in the most direct possible way, and had never, by any account, done anything to resist or question any of it. The distinction between ignorance and willful blindness is one that courts and historians have been wrestling with ever since, and Emmy Göring's case is one of the examples that makes that distinction most difficult to draw. While Hermann Göring stood trial at Nuremberg, Emmy lived in a kind of limbo, moving between different forms of detention and restricted residence as the denazification machinery ground through its processes. She was able to attend the Nuremberg trial proceedings and to visit her husband during the trial, and accounts of those visits describe a couple who maintained genuine warmth and affection even in the shadow of what was coming. Göring performed brilliantly at the trial, outmaneuvering the prosecution's questioning with a combination of intelligence, arrogance, and theatrical skill that his former career as an air ace and political showman had well prepared him for. But the outcome was never really in doubt. On October 1, 1946, Hermann Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Emmy's reaction to the verdict and sentence has been described by those who observed it as one of controlled devastation. She visited him after the verdict and they spoke for some time. Göring had already determined that he would not allow himself to be hanged, a death he regarded as beneath him, and he had concealed a cyanide capsule for exactly this purpose. On the night of October 15, 1946, 2 hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring bit down on the capsule and died in his cell. He had cheated the hangman and, in his own mind at least, preserved some form of dignity. Emmy received the news at Strub Farm in the Bavarian Alps, where she was then living under a form of house arrest. She was told that her husband was dead, that he had taken his own life, and that the chapter of her life that had begun on a stage in Weimar in the early 1930s was definitively, irrevocably over. What happened next was predictable in its broad outlines, but devastating in its specifics. The German denazification courts, established by the Allied authorities to process the millions of former Nazis and Nazi-adjacent individuals who had to be assigned to one of 5 categories of culpability, took up Emmy Göring's case in 1947. This was a different process from the Nuremberg trial, with different standards and different stakes. The denazification process was not primarily about criminal punishment, but about assigning degrees of responsibility and determining what restrictions, if any, should apply to an individual's civic life going forward. Emmy was classified as a Bella-State, an activist or militant, which placed her in the second most serious category of the 5. She was found guilty of being an active Nazi, not simply a passive participant or a follower, but someone who had positively embraced and benefited from the regime. The sentence that followed reflected this classification. Emmy was required to serve 1 year in prison. This was not Nuremberg. She would not hang, would not spend decades behind bars. But 1 year was 1 year, and it was a real imprisonment, not a comfortable internment, that fell on a 54-year-old woman who had spent the previous decades surrounded by luxury. She served the sentence, though the precise conditions and dates of her actual incarceration are subjects on which accounts vary. What is clear is that she emerged from it in reduced circumstances, both materially and socially, and that the process was not yet finished even when the imprisonment ended. The financial penalties were in some ways more enduring than the imprisonment. As a convicted Nazi activist, Emmy was subject to asset confiscation, and a significant portion of whatever remained of the Göring fortune was seized by the German authorities. 30% of her remaining assets were taken. She was also prohibited from working in her profession, from performing on stage, for a period of 5 years. For a woman who had built her entire identity first as an actress and then as a social figure, the prohibition on performance was not merely a financial blow, but a personal one. It stripped away the last independent role she had outside the context of being Göring's widow, and it left her genuinely poor in a way that she had not been at any point in her adult life. The question of what Emmy actually knew about the crimes of the Third Reich is one that the denazification process did not ultimately resolve, and that historians have been wrestling with ever since. The evidence is complex and, in certain respects, contradictory. On one hand, Emmy's direct involvement in political or military decisions was essentially non-existent. She was a hostess and a wife, not a planner or an administrator. On the other hand, the specific nature of her life at the centre of the Göring Empire made certain kinds of ignorance implausible. The art that filled Carinal was not purchased through legitimate channels, and this was not a secret. The persecution of Jews and other minorities under Nazi rule was not a secret. The aggressive war that her husband was helping to plan and execute was not a secret. Emmy's claim to have been simply a wife doing her domestic duties, insulated from all of this, was always going to be difficult to sustain. And there were specific episodes that made the claim of ignorance still more difficult. Emmy was aware, for example, that her husband's art collection had been assembled through confiscation and forced sales rather than legitimate purchase. She knew that many of the works had come from Jewish collectors and dealers who had been stripped of their property. She could not have failed to know this, living as she did among the paintings themselves, hosting the officials who organised the looting, and receiving in her own home the dealers and agents who facilitated it. Whether she found ways to rationalise this, to tell herself that it was simply how things worked in wartime, that others were doing the same and worse, that her own hands were clean because she had not personally signed any confiscation order, we cannot know with certainty. But the evidence does not support a picture of a woman who was genuinely uninformed about the source of her husband's wealth and the objects that surrounded her. There is one episode from Emmy's life before and during the war that complicates any simple picture of her as either complicit monster or innocent bystander, and it deserves careful attention both because it is historically significant and because it reveals something important about the woman herself. Emmy Göring did, on at least one documented and meaningful occasion, use her position and her influence with her husband to try to protect individuals from the Nazi system's worst depredations. This was not a pattern of systematic resistance. It did not add up to anything like opposition to the regime, but it happened, and ignoring it would distort the portrait as surely as ignoring everything else. The case that is most frequently cited involves Emmy's theatrical connections. In the world of German theatre and film in the 1930s and 1940s, many of the most talented and prominent figures were Jewish, or had Jewish family members, or were connected by friendship and professional loyalty to people who were being persecuted. Emmy, who remained genuinely attached to the world of theatre throughout her life, encountered these connections regularly, and on a number of occasions she intervened with her husband on behalf of individuals who were in danger: Jewish colleagues, the family members of theatre friends, people who had been caught in the machinery of persecution and who appealed to Emmy for help. Göring, for his part, was not above issuing what became known informally as exemptions. Schutzjuden, in the crude terminology of the era, using his political authority to protect specific individuals from deportation or worse when it suited him to do so. He did this for various reasons, including genuine personal sentiment, practical considerations, and the kind of Baroque status competition that characterized the Nazi leadership, but Emmy's intercessions were a genuine factor in at least some of these cases. It would be wrong to make too much of this. The scale of Emmy's interventions was tiny relative to the scale of the destruction around her. Every person she helped to protect, if she helped at all, was surrounded by thousands or millions who were not protected, who were deported, murdered, stripped of everything. The system that Emmy's daily life sustained and celebrated was the same system that was doing all of that. A few acts of private mercy do not constitute opposition to genocide, and they do not absolve a person of the responsibility for the benefits they derived from the system that was committing it. But they do add a layer of complexity to what might otherwise be a simple story, and they suggest that Emmy was not entirely without conscience, that she felt something when she saw people in danger, even if what she felt was not enough to make her question the world she was living in. This combination of personal warmth and systemic complicity is actually one of the most characteristic features of the lives of the Nazi wives more generally, and Emmy's case illustrates it with particular clarity. These were not, for the most part, ideological fanatics on the model of their husbands. They were women who had married powerful men, enjoyed the benefits that power brought, and found ways to make themselves comfortable within a system whose fundamental nature they either failed to examine or chose not to. Emmy Göring was more intelligent and more culturally sophisticated than many of her counterparts, which perhaps made her capacity for self-deception both more elaborate and more revealing. She understood the world around her well enough to navigate it skillfully, and that understanding makes her silence about its crimes all the more telling. What was Emmy's daily life actually like at Harrenhal, the great estate that was both the centre of the Göring world and its most opulent symbol? Harrenhal deserves a moment of sustained attention, because it was not merely a house but a statement, a performance of power and aesthetic ambition on a scale that had no real precedent in modern Germany. The estate had begun as a relatively modest hunting lodge in the Schorfheide forest, about 70 kilometres northeast of Berlin. Göring had first established it in the early 1930s as a retreat and a memorial to his first wife, naming it for Karin and burying her remains there in a purpose-built mausoleum in 1934. But the estate grew continuously throughout the Nazi period, driven by Göring's inexhaustible appetite for grandeur and his access to essentially unlimited resources, both public and looted. By the time Emmy was living there regularly in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Harrenhal had grown into an extraordinary complex. The main house was enormous, decorated with carved timber and stone in a style that blended Germanic romantic nationalism with genuine artistic quality. The halls were hung with old masters, works by Rubens, Cranach, Van Dyck, and dozens of other artists of the first rank gathered from across occupied Europe. The dining rooms could seat dozens of guests, served by liveried staff from kitchens that were stocked with the finest ingredients available in wartime Germany and occupied Europe. There was a vast library, an art studio, a cinema room, greenhouses, stables, and a small zoo where Göring kept exotic animals, including lion cubs, which he was photographed with regularly for the Nazi press. There was a model railway layout of enormous scale and complexity, which Göring operated himself and which visitors were expected to admire as charming evidence of the great man's playful side. There was a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and grounds of several thousand acres encompassing forest, lakes, and formal gardens. Emmy moved through all of this every day. She woke in the morning in a bedroom furnished with the kind of objects that would be at home in a major European museum. She ate breakfast in a room hung with paintings that had belonged to Jewish art dealers in Paris or Amsterdam 2 or 3 years earlier. She spent her mornings consulting with the head housekeeper, reviewing the day's menus, checking on the correspondence, preparing for whatever social or domestic obligations the day held. She spent time with Edda, who was growing up in this extraordinary environment as if it were the most natural thing in the world, surrounded by art and luxury and the constant presence of important visitors. In the afternoons, Emmy might receive callers, review the social calendar, correspond with friends and acquaintances in the theatre world, or attend to the organisational details of upcoming events. In the evenings, if there were guests, she presided over dinner with skill and apparent enjoyment, the consummate hostess in the most extravagant setting in Germany. The relationship between Emmy and Hermann Göring is itself worth examining carefully, because it bears on questions about Emmy's knowledge and her choices. Hermann Göring was by any measure a difficult man to be married to. He was physically massive, increasingly corpulent as the war years progressed, and given to elaborate self-dramatization in everything from his uniforms to his gestures to his domestic arrangements. He was addicted to morphine, an addiction that had begun during the chaotic years following the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, and that continued, in varying degrees, throughout his life. He was vain, mercurial, capable of great warmth and great cruelty in rapid succession, and his professional life was one of enormous and unceasing complexity. He was simultaneously running the Luftwaffe, overseeing the 4-year plan for German economic mobilization, managing the looting of occupied Europe, maintaining his position in the complex politics of the Nazi leadership, and conducting the relentless social life that was both his pleasure and his political instrument. Emmy navigated all of this with what appears to have been genuine equanimity and genuine affection. She loved Hermann Göring, or at least she said she did, and behaved as though she did, with a consistency that spanned the entire period of their relationship from the early 1930s to his death in 1946. She was not naive about his faults. She knew about his morphine addiction, though this was not something she discussed publicly. She knew about his appetite for luxury and his capacity for excess. She dealt with the practical consequences of his political life, the sudden changes of schedule, the unexpected guests, the constant demands that the Nazi political world made on his time and attention. She seems to have genuinely believed in him as a man, as a husband, and as a political figure, and this belief appears to have been resistant to evidence that might have disturbed it. After Göring's death, Emmy entered the next phase of her post-war life, which would last for almost 3 decades until her own death in 1973. The arc of those years is simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. A woman who had lived at the pinnacle of European power, reduced to a small apartment in Munich, writing her memoirs and spending her time in a kind of enforced ordinariness that was the precise inverse of everything she had known since 1935. She emerged from prison and the denazification process in the late 1940s to find herself in a Germany that had been physically and morally destroyed, surrounded by the ruins of the world she'd helped to decorate and faced with the task of building some kind of life out of what remained. The Munich apartment that became Emmy's home in the post-war years was a world away from Karinhol. It was small, simply furnished, and located in a city that was still in the process of being rebuilt from the devastation of Allied bombing. Emmy had been stripped of 30% of her assets by the denazification court, had served her prison sentence, and had been prohibited from working in her profession for 5 years. What remained of the Göring fortune after the confiscations and the chaos of the war's end was substantially reduced from its wartime peak. The paintings and sculptures and tapestries that had filled the Göring residences were now mostly in the hands of Allied authorities. subject to restitution claims from the families and institutions they had been stolen from, or dispersed in ways that made recovery difficult or impossible. Emmy's daily life was no longer a question of which dining room to use or how many courses to serve to which dignitaries. It was a question of how to make ends meet on a substantially reduced income in a country that was simultaneously ashamed of its recent past and struggling to understand what that past actually meant. It was in this context that Emmy wrote her autobiography, published in German in 1967 under the title Mein Leben mit Göring, or My Life with Göring. The book is a fascinating document, less for what it reveals than for what it chooses not to reveal. Emmy writes about her husband with unmistakable warmth and genuine feeling. She describes the romantic beginning of their relationship, the grandeur of their wedding, the domestic details of life at Carinhall, the birth of Edda, and the final years of the war and its immediate aftermath. She presents Hermann Göring as a man of artistic sensibility and personal generosity, a devoted husband and father, a man who was in some respects the victim of circumstances and associates beyond his control. She does not dwell on the evidence of his crimes, does not engage systematically with the findings of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and does not attempt any serious reckoning with her own position and knowledge during the years of the Third Reich. What is striking about the autobiography is not its dishonesty so much as its extraordinary selectivity. Emmy was an intelligent woman and she knew perfectly well what had happened and what her husband had done. She had sat in the Nuremberg courtroom while the prosecution laid out the evidence. She had heard the verdict and the sentence. She had lived through the immediate post-war years in a Germany that was slowly coming to terms with the full extent of the Holocaust and the other crimes of the regime. She chose, in writing her memoirs, to focus on the personal and domestic aspects of her life with Göring and to set aside almost entirely the political and criminal context in which that life was embedded. This choice was consistent with everything else she had done, the selective attention, the cultivation of the comfortable rather than the confronting, the preference for the beautiful and the personal over the historical and the moral. The art restitution disputes that dominated much of Emmy's post-war existence were a persistent and painful reminder that the world was not willing to allow her the luxury of that selective attention. Many of the artworks that had decorated Carinhall and the other Göring residences had been seized by Allied forces at the end of the war and held pending restitution claims. Others had been dispersed through various channels during the final chaotic months of the regime. Some had been sold or transferred to various German institutions, and some were still, in various legal jurisdictions, the subject of ongoing disputes about their true ownership. Emmy was involved in several of these disputes, sometimes as a claimant seeking to recover objects she regarded as legitimately hers, and sometimes as a defendant against restitution claims from the original owners or their heirs. The most significant case involved a painting that had been given to Edda Göring at birth as a personal gift, a work attributed to Lucas Cranach the Elder depicting the Madonna and Child, which had been presented to the baby Edda by Nazi officials as a kind of state gift to the Göring family. The painting had passed through various hands during and after the war and became the subject of a prolonged legal dispute that was not resolved until 1968, when the German courts ruled against Edda and ordered the painting's return. Emmy had to watch her daughter lose this case, and the loss represented not merely a financial blow, but a symbolic defeat, a legal affirmation that the gift had not been legitimately Göring property to begin with. But Emmy's post-war life was not simply a story of legal defeats and diminished circumstances. She maintained throughout the decades, after the war, a social and personal life that was, in its own way, remarkable for its resilience and its refusal to be entirely defined by what had happened. She remained in contact with a network of former acquaintances from the theatre world and from the Nazi period, people who for various reasons maintained their friendship with Göring's widow. She attended the theatre and opera when she could. She was known in Munich as a dignified and personable woman who did not complain about her reduced circumstances and who did not seek publicity or make inflammatory statements about the Nazi period. She was, in short, attempting to live a normal life in the aftermath of an extraordinarily abnormal one, and she seems to have managed this with more equanimity than might have been expected. The question of Emmy's relationship with her daughter Edda is one that deserves attention. both because it was clearly the most important personal relationship of her post-war life, and because Edda's own trajectory illuminates aspects of Emmy's legacy that are otherwise difficult to access. Emmy Göring, born in 1938 and thus only 7 years old when the Third Reich collapsed, grew up under the weight of one of the most notorious names in German history. She'd spent her early childhood at Karinhol, surrounded by luxury and photographed for the Nazi press as a charming symbol of the regime's domestic ideals. She had then watched her world collapse, accompanied her mother through detention and restricted residence, and grown up as the daughter of a man who had been convicted of crimes against humanity and died a suicide in his cell at Nuremberg. Edda maintained, throughout her adult life, a posture toward her father's memory that was striking in its contrast to the approach taken by the children of some other Nazi leaders. While figures like Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who had been the Governor-General of occupied Poland, publicly confronted and denounced their father's crimes, Emmy Göring largely refused to participate in this kind of public reckoning. She defended her parents in private, maintained that her father had been a good man who had been misrepresented by history, and declined for the most part to engage in the public discourse about Nazi crimes and their legacy. She broke her silence in a 1986 Swedish television interview to express deep affection for both her parents, and she remained throughout her life convinced that the world's verdict on Hermann Göring was too simple and too harsh. She died in December 2018. Emmy's own public silence on the larger questions of the Third Reich was consistent with Edda's, and it seems clear that the two women reinforced each other's chosen approach to the past. Both preferred the personal to the political, the domestic to the historical, the remembered warmth of family life to the historical evidence of what that family's context actually was. This is humanly understandable. It is also historically inadequate. The story of the Nazi wives, of whom Emmy Göring was in many ways the most prominent, cannot be told honestly without acknowledging both the genuine human dimensions of their lives and the genuine moral failures that their choices represented. Emmy Göring's relationship with the art world deserves a further detailed examination, because art was not peripheral to her life, but absolutely central to it. She had been an actress, which is to say a person whose professional life was built on a specific form of aesthetic judgment and emotional intelligence. She had then become the wife of one of the greatest art collectors in Nazi Germany, a man whose collection, assembled through theft and coercion, eventually rivaled or exceeded those of major European museums. Emmy was not a passive recipient of this art. She was genuinely interested in it, genuinely knowledgeable about it, and genuinely engaged with the aesthetic choices that went into the decoration of the Göring residences. At Karinhol and at the Berlin residence, the walls were hung with an extraordinary collection of old masters: Botticelli, Cranach, Van Dyck, Rubens, Vermeer, Raphael, and dozens of others. There were also significant works by more recent artists, decorative objects of extraordinary quality, medieval armour, tapestries, and furniture. Emmy walked among all of this daily. She had opinions about it. She participated, at least at the level of domestic arrangement, in decisions about where works should be, hung, and how spaces should be organised. She entertained guests in these rooms and discussed the art with them. She was, in the terms in which she understood herself, a cultured and aesthetically engaged woman who happened to live in one of the most remarkable private art collections in the world. The problem, of course, was that this collection had been assembled through the systematic theft of European cultural heritage. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the special organisation established in 1940 under Alfred Rosenberg to confiscate cultural property from Jewish and other targeted owners across occupied Europe, had worked alongside Göring's own agents to supply Karinhol and the other Göring residences with their extraordinary contents. Göring himself was deeply involved in directing this operation, corresponding regularly with the ERR and with his own agents in Paris, Amsterdam, Warsaw, and elsewhere to ensure that the most valuable items were identified and secured for his own collection. He visited Paris in November 1940 and again in February 1941, specifically to review confiscated art and to select pieces for Karinhol, a fact that was documented in detail at the Nuremberg trial. Emmy received the fruits of this operation daily. New works arrived, new pieces were installed. The collection grew continuously throughout the war years, fed by a supply chain of confiscation and theft that was operating across an entire continent. Did Emmy ever ask where a specific painting had come from? Did she ever notice that a work she had seen at a Jewish dealer's gallery in Paris in the late 1930s had now appeared on the wall of Karen Hall? Did she ask her husband to explain the source of his expanding collection? These are questions that cannot be definitively answered on the basis of the available evidence. What can be said is that the Denazification Court, reviewing her case in 1947, found her conduct culpable, and that the post-war restitution process confirmed that a very large proportion of the Göring collection had been stolen from its rightful owners. The precise extent of the Göring collection at its wartime peak has been the subject of considerable scholarly attention. Estimates vary, but the collection is believed to have included somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 individual works of art, in addition to countless decorative objects, pieces of furniture, textiles, and other items. The total value at the time would have been extraordinary, and the value of the works that survive to the present day and have been identified and traced runs into many hundreds of millions of dollars. The process of identifying, locating, and returning this material to its rightful owners or their heirs has been ongoing for more than 70 years and is still not complete. The Allied forces who occupied Karen Hall in 1945 found a chaotic scene. Many works had already been evacuated, some had been damaged or destroyed in the process, and the records necessary to trace the full collection were incomplete. The effort to reconstruct what had been taken, from whom and where it had gone, has occupied art historians, legal experts and restitution specialists for decades. Emmy's daily life, then, was intimately bound up with one of the largest single collections of stolen art in history. She lived with it, cared for it in a domestic sense, discussed it with guests, and derived from her association with it a great deal of her sense of her own cultural identity and social position. The art was not incidental to her life at Karen Hall and in Berlin. It was the visual and aesthetic context in which she moved every day, and it was directly connected to the crimes of her husband and the regime he served. The question of what Emmy told herself about all of this is one that can only be answered through inference, because Emmy herself never directly confronted it in any public way. Her autobiography, Mein Leben mit Göring, discusses the art collection in terms that suggest genuine appreciation and pride, but never addresses its provenance in any meaningful way. Emmy describes the beauty of the works, the pleasure she and her husband took in them, the admiration of visitors, but she does not engage with the question of where they came from or what their presence at Karen Hall signified about the nature of the regime that had put them there. This silence is eloquent in its own way. It suggests not so much deliberate dishonesty as a settled, lifelong preference for the beautiful surface over the disturbing depth, a preference that Emmy seems to have maintained from the beginning of her relationship with Göring to the end of her life. In the years after the autobiography's publication, Emmy became something of an occasionally sought-after historical witness to the Nazi period, though she always appeared reluctant to engage beyond the personal and domestic. Journalists and researchers sometimes sought her out, and when she did speak, she was consistent in her characterization of her husband as a man who had been misunderstood by history, and in her own characterization of herself as a woman who had simply lived the life of a devoted wife. She didn't seek the spotlight in the way that some other Nazi widows did not make inflammatory public statements, did not become a cause célèbre for the West German far right. She seemed genuinely to want to be left alone to live quietly in Munich, to maintain her friendships, to be with her daughter, and to keep the memories of her life with Göring alive in whatever private way she could manage. There was, however, one significant area of post-war activity that Emmy maintained consistently and that bears on the question of her political identity. She remained, throughout the post-war decades, in contact with a network of former Nazi acquaintances and sympathizers, people who had been part of the world she had inhabited and who maintained various degrees of attachment to the ideology and personnel of the Third Reich. This was not unique to Emmy among the Nazi wives. Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, maintained similarly extensive connections to the post-war far right and was involved with the Stille Hilfe, the charitable organization that provided support to former SS members. Margarete Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, lived for years under a false name while maintaining contact with former associates. Emmy's connections were perhaps less politically explicit than some of these, but they existed, and they were part of the context in which she spent her post-war decades. What did Emmy Göring actually do all day in the 27 years between the end of the war and her death in 1973? The answer is, in many ways, less dramatic than the story of her wartime years would lead one to expect. She maintained her apartment in Munich. She attended church. She kept up with friends and former acquaintances. She followed theatrical and artistic events as best she could on a restricted income. She supported her daughter through the legal and personal challenges of growing up as Emmy Göring. She worked on her autobiography. She managed her finances, which required careful attention given the significant reduction in her assets that the denazification process had imposed. She received occasional visitors. She was photographed occasionally for newspapers or magazines that ran retrospective pieces on the Nazi period. She got older. This description of an ordinary domestic life in a small Munich apartment is striking precisely because of the contrast it presents with the life that preceded it. Emmy had spent a decade as one of the most socially prominent women in Europe, presiding over events of international significance in settings of extraordinary grandeur. She had been photographed with heads of state and foreign ministers, had organised dinners at which the fate of Europe was informally discussed, had lived in houses that were in some cases larger and more lavishly appointed than the palaces of actual monarchs. And then, in 1945, all of that had simply stopped, replaced by the ordinariness of Munich in the post-war period, with its bomb damage still visible in the 1950s, its shortage of everything, its collective effort to forget or at least to set aside what had happened between 1933 and 1945. The denazification process that Emmy underwent was part of a massive and often confused effort by the Allied authorities and the new West German state to process millions of former Nazis and Nazi-adjacent individuals. The process was imperfect in many ways, criticised both for being too harsh in individual cases and for failing to adequately punish genuinely serious offenders. Emmy's classification as a belle estate and her year in prison fell somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. More serious than the treatment of many Nazi wives and associates, but far less serious than what the scale of her husband's crimes might arguably have justified. The financial penalties, the confiscation of 30% of her assets, were a real punishment, but they did not leave her destitute, and the prohibition on performing was in practice less significant than it might have been for a younger woman whose career was still at its centre. Looking at the full arc of Emmy Göring's life, from Hamburg merchant's daughter to prominent actress to First Lady of the Third Reich to Munich widow, what conclusions are possible? What does her story actually tell us about the Nazi regime, about the women who were married to its leaders, and about the possibility of individual moral responsibility within a criminal state? One answer is that Emmy's story illustrates with unusual clarity the way in which ordinary human qualities, warmth, love for one's family, aesthetic appreciation, social skill, professional ambition, can coexist with profound moral failure. Emmy was not a monster. The evidence does not support a picture of a woman who actively desired the persecution of Jews, or the conquest of Europe, or the systematic looting of the continent's cultural heritage. She seems to have been, in many respects, a genuinely warm and attractive person who loved her husband, adored her daughter, enjoyed good conversation and fine art, and took considerable pleasure in being good at the social role she played. None of this excuses anything. But it is important to say, because the lesson of the Nazi period is not that its perpetrators and beneficiaries were cartoon villains whose evil was obvious and whose humanity was absent. The lesson is more disturbing than that. The lesson is that ordinary people, people of genuine intelligence and warmth and cultural sophistication, can participate in and benefit from criminal systems while telling themselves stories that make it possible to avoid confronting what they are doing. To fully understand what Emmy Göring actually did all day, it is necessary to step back from the individual and look at the broader social world in which she operated. The Nazi leadership created around itself a remarkable and peculiar social ecosystem, a court in the old European sense of the word, with all the hierarchy, competition, alliance building, and status anxiety that the word implies. At the centre of this court was Hitler himself, whose preferences and moods set the tone for everything that happened around him. Radiating outward from the Führer was a complex hierarchy of power that was simultaneously political, military and social, and that wives and female companions navigated with the same intensity and strategic calculation that their husbands brought to their professional rivalries. Emmy occupied a position near the top of this hierarchy, but her position was always somewhat ambiguous for reasons that illuminate both her character and the peculiar sociology of the Nazi elite. She was married to the second most powerful man in Germany, which should have made her social position unambiguous. But the Nazi regime had no mechanism for formally acknowledging the status of wives and female companions, and this absence created a space in which competitive social claims could be made and contested. Emmy's claim to be the First Lady of the Third Reich was exactly this kind of competitive assertion, made in the absence of any formal protocol that would either confirm it or deny it. The other significant claimants to the title or to the social position it implied were a varied group. There was Eva Braun, of course, but Eva's invisibility in public life before 1945 effectively disqualified her from the social competition, even if it did not diminish her personal significance to Hitler. There was Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister and one of Hitler's closest associates. Magda was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply committed to National Socialism in a way that was ideological rather than merely matrimonial. She had converted to the Nazi cause long before her marriage to Goebbels and maintained a personal relationship with Hitler that gave her a degree of access and influence that was independent of her husband's position. Hitler regarded Magda with something close to admiration, and she was one of the very few women he treated as a genuine intellectual equal. The relationship between Emmy Göring and Magda Goebbels was characterized by the kind of frigid mutual courtesy that sophisticated people manage when they dislike each other but are forced to interact regularly. They occupied the same social world, attended many of the same events, and had no choice but to deal with each other at state functions and private gatherings. But they were not friends, and their competition for social precedence was a persistent undercurrent in the social life of the Nazi elite. Magda, backed by her husband's propaganda empire and her personal relationship with Hitler, probably had the stronger claim to social preeminence. But Emmy, backed by Göring's extraordinary wealth and her own skill as a hostess, was a formidable competitor. Their rivalry was real and was observed with interest by those around them. There was also Lena Heydrich, the wife of Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. Lena was a committed Nazi ideologue who had, by her own account, encouraged her husband to pursue his SS career and who was deeply invested in the ideology of the regime. She was not a social figure of the first rank in the way that Emmy and Magda were, but she was a significant presence in the social world of the SS leadership, and her relationship with Emmy and Magda was coloured by the same competitive dynamics that characterised all relationships within the Nazi court. Lena survived the war and lived until 1985, writing a memoir in 1976 that she titled, with characteristic boldness, Life with a War Criminal. Margaret Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, occupied a position that was in some ways more powerful and in some ways less than Emmy's. Heinrich Himmler was in many respects the most powerful man in Nazi Germany after Hitler himself, controlling the SS, the Gestapo, and the entire apparatus of terror and repression. But Margaret's relationship with her husband had effectively collapsed by 1941 when she discovered that he was involved with his personal secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom he eventually had 2 children. The marriage continued in a formal sense, but the personal dimension was gone, and this affected Margaret's social position within the Nazi hierarchy. She remained the wife of the Reichsführer SS, which carried its own weight, but she was increasingly marginalized from the social world that Emmy continued to dominate. The 2 women were not friends, and Emmy's warmth and social ease contrasted sharply with Margaret's reputation for cold inflexibility and social awkwardness. Understanding Emmy in the context of these relationships, and within the broader context of the social world of the Nazi wives, helps to explain certain things about her daily life and her self-presentation that might otherwise seem puzzling. The role of First Lady that Emmy claimed was not merely a personal vanity. It was a carefully constructed social position that she maintained with skill and deliberateness, and its maintenance required constant effort, attention, and the kind of strategic social intelligence that Emmy possessed in abundance. Every state dinner she organised, every diplomatic reception she presided over, every careful balance she struck between warmth and authority in her interactions with other Nazi wives and their husbands was part of the ongoing performance of the role she had claimed for herself. This performance extended to her physical appearance and her cultivation of herself as a public figure. Emmy was not a conventionally beautiful woman by the standards of the era, but she was attractive, well-presented, and skilled in the arts of making the most of her appearance. She dressed with care and considerable expense in clothes that were appropriate to her position without being ostentatious in ways that might attract Hitler's Puritan disapproval of excess, a disapproval that was itself somewhat hypocritical, given the regime's overall appetite for luxury, but which was real enough to influence the social calculations of those around him. Emmy wore jewellery, but not too much. She dressed well, but not extravagantly. She presented herself as the cultivated, tasteful wife of a great man, and she sustained this presentation throughout the years of her prominence. The social calendar that Emmy managed was genuinely formidable in its scope and complexity. A typical week during the peak years of the Third Reich might include a formal state dinner at the Berlin residence for foreign dignitaries, an afternoon reception for German artists and performers whose work Göring wished to patronize, an evening at the opera with a distinguished guest in the Göring box, a weekend at Hall with a smaller group of Nazi colleagues and their wives, and numerous smaller social obligations, lunches, teas, informal gatherings, and the constant round of calls and correspondence that sustained the social fabric of the Nazi elite. Emmy managed all of this while also running the household, caring for Edda, maintaining her own personal friendships and professional connections, and sustaining what appears to have been a genuinely happy marriage to a man who was simultaneously one of the most powerful and one of the most difficult personalities in Germany. The foreign policy dimension of Emmy's social role deserves particular attention because it was one of the areas where her activities had the most direct political significance. In the years before the war and during its early period, the Göring residence in Berlin and the estate at Hall were important venues for diplomatic encounters that complemented and sometimes preceded or followed the formal diplomatic meetings that took place through official channels. Göring entertained a wide variety of foreign visitors, from the Swedish industrialist and aviation pioneer Carl Gustaf von Rosen, to British politicians and officials who came to Germany in the late 1930s, hoping to find a basis for the accommodation with Hitler that became known as appeasement. Emmy was present at many of these encounters and played an active social role in them. She was charming to the foreign visitors, spoke easily about art and culture, and created an atmosphere of civilized normality that was, of course, itself a kind of political performance. The message conveyed by a pleasant evening at the Göring residence with fine food and fine art and a gracious and cultured hostess was that Nazi Germany was a normal country, that its leadership were civilized people who could be dealt with, that the alarming aspects of the regime that foreign observers might have seen were exaggerations or misunderstandings. This was a lie, and Emmy was part of telling it, whether she fully understood her role or not. One of the more significant visits of this kind was that of Lord Halifax, the British Foreign Secretary, in November 1937. Halifax had come to Germany for what was officially a hunting invitation from Göring, taking advantage of the latter's role as master of the German hunt. But the visit had obvious political dimensions. Halifax met with Hitler, and he also spent time with Göring at Hall, where Emmy played her role as hostess with characteristic skill. The conversations during this visit were part of the process by which the British government was attempting to understand what Nazi Germany wanted and whether a negotiated settlement of European tensions was possible. They also, in ways that only became clear later, contributed to Chamberlain's conviction that Hitler was amenable to reasonable negotiation, a conviction that would have devastating consequences. Emmy was not making foreign policy, but she was part of the social context in which foreign policy was made. The question of what Emmy knew about specific Nazi crimes is worth returning to in the context of her diplomatic and social role. The Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, in which thousands of Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues across Germany were attacked and destroyed, Jewish men were beaten and murdered, and tens of thousands were arrested and sent to concentration camps, occurred less than a year after Lord Halifax's visit, and during the period when Emmy was at the height of her social prominence. What did Emmy know about what happened on Kristallnacht? What did she say or think about it? The historical record is silent on Emmy's personal response to this event, which is itself revealing. Kristallnacht was neither subtle nor secret. It was conducted in public across Germany, and the destruction and violence were visible to anyone who walked through a German city in the days that followed. Emmy was in Germany, She cannot have been unaware of what had happened. Hermann Göring's response to Kristallnacht is well documented and deeply revealing. He was furious, not about the violence itself, not about the murder and destruction, but about the economic consequences of the pogrom. He complained bitterly that the destruction of Jewish businesses and the disruption of economic life was contrary to the needs of his 4-year plan, and he imposed an enormous collective fine on the German Jewish community to pay for the damage, a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks. He also used the occasion to accelerate the process of Aryanization, the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to German owners, in ways that directly benefited himself and his associates. Emmy was Göring's wife and lived with him through these days. She cannot have been ignorant of his response to Kristallnacht or of the economic and political calculations that underpinned it. The years between the outbreak of war in September 1939 and the turning point at Stalingrad in early 1943 were, paradoxically, in some ways the most comfortable period of Emmy's life at the centre of the Third Reich. The early military successes, the quick defeat of Poland, the stunning fall of France in 1940, the occupation of most of Western Europe, created an atmosphere of triumphalism within the Nazi leadership that translated into an expansion of the luxury and social extravagance that already characterized their lives. Göring's standing with Hitler was at its peak in the years 1939 to 1941, when the Luftwaffe's role in the early campaigns seemed to vindicate his confident predictions about air power. The resources flowing through the regime were at their maximum. The looting of occupied Europe was proceeding at its most intense. And Emmy was at the centre of this world, presiding over its social life with all the skill and grace she had developed over years of practice. The war changed the texture of daily life at Karen Hall in ways that were gradual but cumulatively significant. There were more military visitors and fewer civilian diplomats. The conversations at dinner were more likely to concern operational matters, supply problems, strategic questions, and less likely to range freely across art and theatre and cultural life. The bombing raids on Berlin, which became serious from 1943 onward, required emergency preparations and occasional evacuations. Göring's mood darkened as the Luftwaffe's failures mounted. The failure to knock Britain out of the war in 1940, the catastrophic losses in the attempt to supply Stalingrad by air in the winter of 1942 to 1943, the inability to defend German cities against the mounting Allied bombing offensive. He withdrew increasingly into morphine and the fantasy world of Karen Hall, playing with his model railway, admiring his art collection, hunting in the forests of the Schorfheide, while the real war went increasingly badly. Emmy managed this changed domestic world with the same professionalism and apparent equanimity she brought to everything. Göring's darkening mood and his growing estrangement from Hitler required careful management of the household and the social calendar. Events that might once have been opportunities for triumphant display became more muted, more carefully calibrated to avoid topics and references that would remind guests of the military reversals. Emmy was not a strategist, and she was not a counsellor in any formal sense, but she was a shrewd social intelligence who understood the dynamics of the world she was operating in, and she adapted her social performance to the changing circumstances. The evacuation of Karen Hall in early 1945 was a logistical undertaking of considerable complexity, and the historical accounts of how it was managed give a sense of the extraordinary resources that the Göring household still commanded even in the final months of the collapsing Reich. Dozens of trucks were loaded with artworks, furniture, silverware, and personal belongings. Trains were commandeered to carry the most valuable pieces to Bavaria. Göring's personal train, a luxurious private consist of several cars, was used to transport Emmy, Edda, and selected household staff to Obersalzberg as American forces advanced through Germany. The scale of the operation was remarkable. A reminder that even in the last months of the war, when German civilians were living on drastically reduced rations and Allied bombing was systematically destroying the infrastructure of daily life, the Nazi leadership continued to command extraordinary resources for their personal comfort and security. Emmy arrived at Obersalzberg in February 1945, joining the community of Nazi families who had gathered in the area around Berchtesgaden as Berlin became increasingly untenable. The atmosphere was surreal. A community of people, connected to the most powerful government in Europe, trying to continue something like normal life in the shadow of total defeat. Emmy was with Edda. She was in the family's mountain villa, comfortable by the standards of the collapsing Reich, if nothing else. She was waiting, as everyone was waiting, for something, for the war to end, for an armistice, for a negotiated settlement, for any outcome other than the unconditional surrender that was, in fact, what was coming. The final act came quickly. American forces reached Berchtesgaden in early May 1945. Göring himself, having made his ill-fated attempt to assume leadership of Germany from Hitler, having been arrested by the SS on Hitler's orders, having been rescued by the advancing Americans, had by this point surrendered to the United States Army. Emmy was at the villa when the Americans arrived. She was calm, according to accounts from that period. She had been expecting this moment, in some sense, for some time, and the practical emergency of dealing with it left little room for the kind of emotional display that might otherwise have been expected. What happened to Emmy Göring in the immediate weeks and months after the war's end illustrates the intersection of the personal and the political that had characterized her life throughout the Nazi period. She was a widow, in practical terms, before she was officially a widow. Göring was alive and in American custody, but the relationship as she had lived it was over. She was a woman of 52 with a 7-year-old daughter, reduced from extraordinary wealth to something considerably more modest, facing a legal process whose outcome she could not predict in a country that had been physically destroyed, and was in the early stages of a moral reckoning whose depth she probably could not yet gauge. The Nuremberg trial, which ran from November 1945 to October 1946, was the central event of the post-war reckoning for Emmy, as it was for the wives of all the other defendants. She was not herself on trial, but she was deeply implicated in the process both as the wife of the most theatrically significant defendant and as a potential witness to events and conversations that the prosecution was attempting to document. She attended sessions of the trial when she was permitted to do so, observing her husband's performance in the dock with an attention that those who saw her described as intense and controlled. She maintained regular contact with Göring through the channels available to family members of defendants, and she was one of the people Göring was most focused on communicating with during the long months of the proceedings. Göring's performance at Nuremberg has been widely analysed and remains genuinely remarkable in historical terms. He was the most senior defendant, the most intellectually formidable, and in some ways the most morally candid. He acknowledged freely that he had known what the Nazi regime was doing, defended many of its actions on strategic and nationalist grounds, and refused to pretend either ignorance or remorse in the way that many of his co-defendants did. He was determined to make the trial a political performance as well as a legal proceeding, and to some considerable degree he succeeded. The American prosecutors, particularly Robert Jackson, found him genuinely difficult to cross-examine, and Göring's interventions and answers during the proceedings were often intellectually compelling, even when they were morally repugnant. What Emmy made of all this, what she thought about her husband's decisions about how to conduct himself at the trial, is another question that the historical record cannot fully answer. She had been with him through everything: the years of triumph, the years of decline, the final catastrophic collapse. She had been his hostess, his domestic manager, his social partner, his mother, and champion of his daughter. She had invested everything: her social identity, her material comfort, her emotional life, in the enterprise of being Emmy Göring. And now she was watching the enterprise being publicly dismantled, the full account of what it had rested on being laid out in excruciating detail by teams of lawyers with mountains of documentary evidence. How did she process that? The evidence suggests that she processed it by maintaining her belief in her husband as a man, by separating the Hermann Göring she had loved from the crimes being attributed to him in the Nuremberg courtroom, and by telling herself and others that the full picture was more complicated than the prosecution was presenting. This is a very human response to an enormously painful situation. It is also, from a historical perspective, completely inadequate to the reality of what the evidence at Nuremberg demonstrated. The crimes of the Nazi regime were not complicated or ambiguous. They were documented in extraordinary detail in the regime's own records, and they were horrific on a scale that no amount of personal affection for the perpetrators could meaningfully mitigate. Emmy's last meeting with Göring, following his conviction and death sentence, has been described in accounts by American personnel present at Nuremberg as a scene of genuine emotion and genuine connection. They spoke through a glass partition in the presence of guards for a limited time. Whatever they said to each other in those final meetings, whatever private reckoning Emmy and Hermann managed in the limited circumstances available to them, remained private. When Göring died on the night of October 15, 1946, Emmy was not there. She received the news at a distance, in Bavaria, and the reaction that has been described in accounts from that period is of a woman who was devastated, but also, in some sense, not entirely surprised. She had known who she married. She had known what he was capable of, even if she had never fully confronted what he had done. The post-war years in Munich brought Emmy into contact with the new Germany in ways that were sometimes painful and sometimes surprising. Munich was a city with a particular relationship to the Nazi past, having been both the birthplace of the movement, the city where Hitler had launched the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, and a centre of the artistic and cultural life that the Nazis had simultaneously patronised and corrupted. In the post-war period, Munich was also one of the most important centres of the denazification process, and one of the cities most intensely engaged in the complicated cultural and political work of reconstructing a German identity that could survive what the Nazi period had revealed about German capacities. Emmy lived in this environment as a known and recognisable figure, the former wife of Hermann Göring, the former hostess of state functions, the former First Lady of the Third Reich. She could not be anonymous in Munich in the way that a more obscure figure might have been. She was occasionally recognised, occasionally photographed, occasionally approached by journalists or researchers. She handled these encounters with the same combination of warmth and careful selectivity that characterised everything else in her post-war public presentation. She was cordial. She was guarded. She was consistent in her characterization of her husband as a man she had loved, and of her own life as one that had been devoted to family and home rather than politics. The theatrical and cultural world that had been Emmy's original home was largely closed to her in the immediate post-war years, both by the formal prohibition on her performing and by the more informal social changes that made her connection to the Nazi period a complicating factor in any professional context. The German cultural world was engaged in its own reckoning with what had happened, sorting out who had collaborated, who had been complicit, who had maintained their integrity, and who had compromised themselves for career advantage, or worse. Emmy's position in this sorting was not ambiguous. She had been the most prominent female figure in the cultural patronage network of the Nazi state, married to a man who spent enormous sums on the arts while simultaneously corrupting and debasing artistic life in Germany. Returning to the stage after the war was not a realistic option. Instead, Emmy's engagement with the cultural world that she still genuinely loved took the form of attendance rather than participation. She went to the theatre. She went to concerts and opera performances. She maintained friendships with people from the theatre world who were willing to maintain them with her, and these friendships appear to have been genuinely important to her in the post-war years, a connection to the life she had had before Hermann Göring, to the identity she had built on her own before everything had been subsumed into the identity of being his wife. The Emmy Sonnemann, who had spent 20 years building an acting career, was still in there somewhere, and the culture she had loved before she married into power was one of the things she held onto in the years when everything else was stripped away. The publication of Mein Leben mit Göring in 1967 was an event that attracted considerable attention in West Germany, coming as it did during a period of renewed public debate about the Nazi past. The mid-1960s were a time when West German society was beginning to engage more seriously with the question of what had happened and who bore responsibility, a process accelerated by the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials of 1963 to 1965, and by the generational challenge posed by the young people who would fuel the 1968 protests and demand a more honest accounting of their parents' and grandparents' roles. Emmy's memoir appeared in this context, and its reception reflected the tensions of the moment. Some reviewers and commentators found the book offensive in its apparent determination to avoid any meaningful reckoning with the crimes of the regime. Others treated it as a historical document of value precisely because of the intimate domestic perspective it offered on the Nazi leadership. Emmy herself gave limited interviews around the time of the publication, maintaining her consistent position. She had loved her husband, she had known him as a man of complexity and warmth, and she did not accept that the verdict of history as expressed at Nuremberg was the complete or fair picture. She was 80 years old when she died in Munich on June 8, 1973. She outlived many of her contemporaries from the Nazi period and outlived the denazification process that had judged her by more than 2 decades. The historical question of how to evaluate Emmy Göring is one that becomes more complex, not less, the more closely it is examined. She was convicted by a German denazification court and served time in prison, which means that the legal system of her own country made a judgment about her culpability. She lost a significant portion of her assets through confiscation, which means that the material benefits she had derived from the regime were partially, if far from completely, clawed back. She was prohibited from pursuing her professional career for 5 years, which imposed a real consequence on her ability to reconstruct her life. These are not trivial outcomes, and they represent a genuine attempt by the post-war German legal system to hold her accountable for her role. At the same time, the punishment was clearly not commensurate with the scale of what her daily life had been embedded in. A year in prison and the loss of 30% of her assets, while genuine consequences, are not equivalent to the accounting demanded by the scale of the crimes that the Göring household had sustained and celebrated. The art alone that Emmy had walked past every day of her life at Hall, the paintings and sculptures and tapestries taken from Jewish collectors and occupied nations, represented a cultural theft of incalculable magnitude. The diplomatic entertainments she had organized had served a regime that was systematically murdering millions of people. The household she had managed had been financed by the corruption and exploitation of an entire continent. A year in prison and 30% asset confiscation is a limited accounting for that level of implication. But the denazification process was not designed to deliver comprehensive moral justice. It was designed to process millions of people through a legal framework that allowed German society to move forward while acknowledging at least some degree of accountability. In this limited sense, Emmy's case was handled appropriately within the framework that existed. The framework itself was inadequate to the scale of what it was addressing, but that was a failure of the system as a whole, not a specific injustice done to Emmy or to any other individual within it. What Emmy Göring's story ultimately illustrates with more clarity than almost any other individual case from the Nazi period is the extraordinary ordinariness that lies at the heart of the most extraordinary evil. The Hannah Arendt observation about the banality of evil, made in the context of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, applies with a different but related force to Emmy's situation. Eichmann was banal in the sense that he was a bureaucratic functionary who processed murder without engaging with its moral content. Emmy was banal in a different sense. She was a woman who lived her domestic and social life, who organized dinner parties and managed a large household and raised a daughter and loved her husband in the immediate proximity of one of the greatest criminal enterprises in human history, and never found a way to make the connection between the beautiful surface of her life and the horrific foundations on which it rested. The specific gifts that Emmy brought to her role, her theatrical training, her social intelligence, her genuine cultural knowledge, her warmth and charm, all of these qualities that made her effective as a hostess and pleasant as a human being also made her more effective as a tool of the regime's self-presentation. A less charming and intelligent First Lady of the Third Reich would have been less useful, less convincing, less able to create the impression of civilized normality that the Göring social world was designed to project. Emmy's virtues, to the extent that she had them, were instrumentalized by the regime she lived in, and she allowed this to happen without apparent resistance throughout the years of the Third Reich's existence. To explore what Emmy Göring actually did all day at its fullest level of detail, it is worth reconstructing, as far as the historical evidence allows, a specific and representative day in her life at the height of her power and prominence. Let us choose a day in, say, the summer of 1938, when the Third Reich was at the apex of its pre-war confidence, when the annexation of Austria had just been completed, when the Munich Agreement that handed the Sudetenland to Germany was still months away, and when the world still had not fully grasped what was coming. Emmy was 45 years old. Edda was just a few months old, born in June of that year. Hall was at its most magnificent, and Emmy's position as the leading social figure in the Third Reich was as secure as it would ever be. Emmy's morning at Hall would have begun early by the standards of the political world she inhabited. Göring was a late riser by nature, and the household rhythm tended to follow his. But Emmy, who had a baby to attend to and a large household to manage, would have been up before her husband. Breakfast with Edda, consultations with the nanny, discussions with the head housekeeper about the day's domestic requirements. On a day with formal guests arriving, the consultations would have been extensive. What were they eating for dinner, for lunch, for the following day's breakfast? What flowers were needed for the dining rooms and public spaces? Was the best silver being used, or the second best? Which guest rooms were being occupied, and were they properly prepared? These were not trivial questions in a household where foreign dignitaries and senior Nazi officials were regular guests, and where any failure of the domestic machinery would reflect directly on Emmy and indirectly on Göring. After the household consultations, Emmy would typically have attended to her personal correspondence. This was substantial. As one of the most prominent women in Germany, she received a great deal of mail, from charities seeking her patronage, from artists and performers seeking her husband's support, from acquaintances maintaining social connections, from former theatrical colleagues, from well-wishers, and from people who wanted something. Sorting through this correspondence, deciding what required her personal attention and what could be handled by a secretary, was itself a task that occupied a significant portion of any morning. She also wrote letters herself to maintain the social connections that were both personally meaningful and politically useful, to thank guests for visits, to issue invitations, to maintain the web of relationships that gave the Göring social world its density and its usefulness. By late morning, Emmy might have moved into the art galleries at Hall, accompanying Göring as he reviewed new acquisitions or showed pieces to visitors. Göring loved displaying his collection, and Emmy was an able interlocutor on matters of aesthetic quality and historical significance. She could discuss the Italian Renaissance with genuine knowledge, could distinguish between schools and periods, could engage with questions about attribution and authenticity with more than polite interest. These discussions were not merely social performances, they reflected real aesthetic engagement, and Emmy's role in them was not passive. She had opinions, expressed them, and was listened to with genuine attention both by her husband and by the visitors who came to Hall to see what was perhaps the most remarkable private art collection in Europe. The afternoon might have brought a formal lunch for visitors who were staying at Hall for a hunting party or a diplomatic meeting. Lunch at Hall during this period could be an elaborate affair lasting 2 hours or more, with multiple courses, fine wines, and the kind of wide-ranging conversation that Göring cultivated as a political and social instrument. Emmy's role was to facilitate this conversation, to draw out quieter guests, to steer discussions away from sensitive topics, to create an atmosphere of relaxed informality that made guests feel that they were seeing the real Hermann Göring, rather than the official version. This was skilled social work, and it required constant attention and judgment. The wrong comment at the wrong moment could change the entire dynamic of the table. The right question, asked of the right person at the right time, could open up a conversation that had real political consequences. The evenings at Hall during the summer were often social events of considerable formality. If there were important guests, dinner would be served at the long table in the main dining room, with formal place settings, multiple courses, and musical entertainment provided by performers whom Göring had commissioned or invited. Emmy would spend part of the afternoon preparing for these evenings, reviewing the seating arrangements, checking in with the kitchen about timing, consulting with Göring about any particular protocol requirements for specific guests, ensuring that the decorations and the environment were what she wanted them to be. Then she would change into evening dress, do her hair and jewellery, and descend to the public rooms to begin the social performance that was her primary contribution to the political life of the Third Reich. After the guests had departed or retired, Emmy and Göring would typically have a period of private time. What they talked about in these private moments, what Göring shared with his wife about his official activities and concerns, what Emmy said or thought about the political world she was embedded in, is something that can only be inferred. Göring was not a man who maintained strict compartments between his professional and personal life, and the conversations at Hall, even in private, would have been coloured by the political context of the moment. The summer of 1938 was a period of intense diplomatic activity around the Czech question, and Göring was deeply involved in the manoeuvring that preceded the Munich Agreement. Did he discuss this with Emmy? Did he tell her what he knew about what was coming, what the regime's intentions were, what the calculations behind the diplomatic surface were? The evidence does not tell us. What it tells us is that Emmy lived in this world, absorbed it, and made it the context of her daily life without apparent distress. This reconstruction of a single day is necessarily incomplete and in some ways speculative, but it serves to illustrate the basic texture of Emmy's existence at the centre of the Third Reich. It was a life of genuine activity and genuine responsibility, of real aesthetic engagement and genuine social skill lived in the immediate proximity of one of the greatest criminal enterprises in human history. The activities themselves, managing a household, organizing social events, caring for a child, maintaining relationships, engaging with art and culture, were not inherently criminal. They were the activities of a woman who happened to be living the wrong life in the wrong place at the wrong time, or who chose to live that life and who found ways to remain comfortable in it. The social world of Carinhall also brought Emmy into regular contact with the military dimension of the Third Reich in ways that are worth noting. Göring's primary official role was as Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and military visitors were frequent at Carinhall throughout the Nazi period. Senior Luftwaffe officers, Wehrmacht commanders, visiting military figures from Allied and neutral nations all passed through the estate and were entertained by Emmy with the same skill and grace she brought to all her social duties. These encounters gave Emmy a degree of familiarity with the military world of the Nazi state that went beyond what most civilian women of her era would have had. She knew generals and admirals by name, understood the broad outlines of operational planning and strategic debate, and was aware, at least in general terms, of how the military situation was developing at any given point in the war. She was also present, in various ways, for some of the most significant moments in the development of Nazi military policy. Göring's role in the planning and execution of the Luftwaffe's campaigns, from the early support of the Condor Legion in the Spanish Civil War to the bombing of Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Britain, and eventually the Soviet Union, was a constant backdrop to Emmy's domestic life. When Göring returned from operational decisions, from planning meetings, from visits to Luftwaffe units, Emmy was there to receive him. When he was elated by success, she shared the elation. When he was furious at failure, she managed the aftermath. She was not a military advisor or a strategic planner, but she was the domestic partner of a man who was making decisions that determined the fate of nations, and she cannot have been entirely insulated from the nature of what those decisions were. The bombing of Coventry on the night of November 14th to 15th, 1940, for example, was a Luftwaffe operation that Göring took a direct and active interest in, regarding it as a demonstration of the Luftwaffe's capability and a potential turning point in the air campaign against Britain. Göring was present at the operational planning sessions for the raid. He was aware of its scale and its targets. Emmy, who was at Carinhall during this period, would have known that something significant was happening, would have seen or felt her husband's engagement with a major operation, would have heard the triumphalism with which the destruction of an English city was initially greeted in the German High Command. Whether she thought about the people of Coventry, the civilians sheltering in the cathedral, and the streets and the houses, whether she made any connection between the celebration around her and the deaths of hundreds of people in a city she had probably never visited, we cannot know. What we know is that the celebration was her context, and that she did not leave it. The relationship between Emmy Göring and the artists and performers who populated the cultural life of the Third Reich is another dimension of her story that deserves careful attention. Emmy had spent 20 years in the professional theatre before her marriage to Göring, and she maintained throughout the Nazi period genuine and sustained connections to the artistic world. Göring was himself a significant patron of the arts, spending lavishly on the state opera and on individual performers and ensembles that caught his interest, and Emmy's knowledge and enthusiasm made her an effective partner in this patronage. She attended performances regularly, formed opinions about them, and brought her assessments back to Göring in ways that influenced his support for specific artists and institutions. The cultural world of Nazi Germany was itself deeply compromised by its relationship with the regime. Some artists had left, the great exodus of German cultural talent that had taken figures like Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Weill, and many others out of Germany in the 1930s. Others had stayed, making various accommodations with the regime, some enthusiastically and some reluctantly. The state opera and the major theatres continued to function, presenting German classical repertoire and increasingly restricted programs as the regime's cultural controls tightened. Emmy moved through this world with familiarity and genuine appreciation, attending performances that gave her real pleasure while remaining part of the apparatus that was simultaneously corrupting and, in some cases, destroying the cultural institutions and individuals she claimed to love. This contradiction between genuine aesthetic appreciation and participation in a system that was corrupting the culture it claimed to celebrate is characteristic of the broader contradictions of Emmy's position. She was not a simple hypocrite. The appreciation was real. But the context in which it occurred made it something different from innocent cultural enjoyment, and Emmy never appears to have found a way to acknowledge this distinction or to act on it. In the years between the end of the war and her death, Emmy was occasionally asked directly about the Holocaust and about the specific crimes documented at Nuremberg. Her responses, on the rare occasions when she gave them, were consistent and revealing. She did not deny that terrible things had happened. She did not claim that the Holocaust was a fabrication or a misrepresentation, but she consistently placed these events at a distance from her own experience and her own knowledge, presenting herself as someone who had been insulated from the worst aspects of the regime by virtue of her domestic role and her husband's care to shield her from disturbing information. This position was, as we have seen, difficult to sustain in the face of what is actually known about the Göring household and about Emmy's daily life, but she sustained it consistently until the end. Her death in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80, was noted in the German press but attracted limited attention outside Germany. She had been old news for a long time. The world had moved on, new scandals and new stories had replaced the Nazi past as the focus of public attention, and Emmy Göring had settled into a kind of historical background noise, present in the memories of those who had known the Nazi period personally and in the footnotes of the historians who were still working to understand it. She was buried in Munich. Her daughter Edda attended the funeral, and a small number of friends and former acquaintances who had maintained their connections to her over the post-war decades. The assessment of Emmy Göring that history has settled on is not one of the harsher verdicts that the Nazi period has produced. She is not remembered as a monster. She is remembered, when she is remembered at all, as a woman who made a particular set of choices in a particular historical context. Choices that allowed her to live very well for a decade while the world around her was being destroyed, and who then spent the rest of a long life finding ways to live with those choices without fully confronting them. This is not an admirable story, but it is a recognizably human one, and it is told in the specific details of her daily life, in the dinner parties and the art galleries and the diplomatic receptions and the Munich apartment, with a clarity that makes it more disturbing, not less, than a simpler story of straightforward villainy would be. Emmy Göring's life asks us, as all the lives of the Nazi period's perpetrators and beneficiaries ultimately ask us, to confront the specific mechanisms by which ordinary people come to participate in and sustain extraordinary crimes. She was not exceptional in her weakness. She was not unique in her capacity for selective attention, for the prioritization of personal comfort over moral clarity, for the love of beautiful things that could be maintained only at terrible cost to others. These capacities exist in all of us. And the lesson of her story is not that she was a monster, but that she was a person, and that persons, given the right circumstances, can accommodate themselves to monstrous things with remarkable ease and remarkable thoroughness. That is what makes the history of the Nazi period so difficult, and so important, and so necessary to continue examining and re-examining long after the generation that lived it has passed away. The story of what Emmy Göring actually did all day is ultimately a story about the domestic life of the Third Reich, told from the inside. It is a story about the social machinery that sustained the Nazi elite, about the role of women in that machinery, about the way in which personal warmth and genuine human feeling can coexist with participation in criminal systems, and about the particular kind of moral failure that consists not in active evil but in the sustained, systematic, and apparently comfortable avoidance of a truth that is present in every room of the house you live in every painting on the wall, in every dinner you serve to the men who are directing the destruction of an entire civilization. Emmy Göring looked at all of this every day and found ways not to see it. And when the Third Reich ended and the reckoning came, she spent the rest of her life finding ways not to look back at it either. That choice, too, was something she did all day. Every day, until the day she died. Well, that is it for today. Emmy Göring lived one of the most extraordinary and morally troubling lives of the 20th century, at the very center of a criminal regime that changed the world forever, and yet she spent decades insisting that she had been merely a wife, merely a mother, merely a hostess. The truth, as we have seen, was considerably more complicated than that. If you found this exploration of Emmy's life and world fascinating, We think you will also want to watch our video on the horrifying crimes of Hermann Göring himself, which goes deep into the acts that the man she loved was directing while she organized the dinner parties. And if the question of how the Nazi wives navigated their world interests you, our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II tells the whole story of that remarkable and disturbing cohort. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one. But before we close, there are a number of additional dimensions of Emmy Göring's story that deserve fuller treatment, because they illuminate aspects of her life and her world that have not yet been fully explored. One of the most significant of these is the question of Emmy's relationship with Hermann Göring's first wife, Karin, or rather with Karin's memory and legacy, which was a constant presence in their marriage and in the domestic world of Karinhol from the very beginning. Karin von Kantzow, born Karin Axelina Hulda Fock in 1888 in Stockholm, had been a Swedish aristocrat of genuine distinction when she met Hermann Göring in 1920. She was married at the time to Swedish army officer Niels Gustaf von Kantzow, with whom she had a son, Thomas. Her encounter with the young Hermann Göring, at that point a war hero and early Nazi activist, was apparently transformative for both of them, and the relationship that developed had the passionate, consuming quality that would become characteristic of Göring's emotional life. Karin divorced her husband, gave up her Swedish life, and devoted herself to Göring and to the Nazi movement with a commitment that was both personal and ideological. She had genuine health problems throughout her life, suffering from a heart condition and from epilepsy, and the years of poverty and political struggle that characterized the early Nazi movement took a serious toll on her. She died on October 17, 1931, at the age of 42, before the Nazi seizure of power that she had worked toward and believed in. Göring's grief at Karin's death was extreme and theatrical, as was characteristic of him in everything, but it also appears to have been genuine. He spoke of her constantly in the years after her death, kept her portrait prominently displayed in every residence, and as we have noted, named his great estate for her and had her remains moved there in a ceremonial reburial in 1934. By the time Emmy entered his life, Karin had become something close to a secular saint in the Göring mythology, and Emmy had to navigate the awkward position of being the second wife in a marriage where the first wife had been elevated to near sacred status. This was not a simple situation for Emmy, and her navigation of it reveals something important about her character and her skills. She does not appear to have been openly resentful of Karin's memory or competitive with it. She maintained Karin's portrait in the places Göring had established for it, accepted the naming of Karinhol without objection, and seems to have understood that the first marriage was part of Hermann Göring's identity in ways that she needed to accommodate rather than challenge. This accommodation was either genuinely generous or strategically wise, and probably both. Emmy was secure enough in her own identity and in her relationship with Göring to tolerate the presence of a predecessor's ghost without apparent anxiety, and this security was itself part of what made her an effective partner for a man as volatile and emotionally demanding as Göring. The presence of Karin's memory at Karinhol was itself a kind of daily fact of Emmy's life there. The mausoleum on the grounds, the portraits in the public rooms, the name on every document and invitation related to the estate, all of these were constant reminders that this particular corner of the Third Reich's social landscape had a prior history that predated Emmy and would have a symbolic afterlife that extended beyond her. When Emmy walked through Karinhol's great halls, she walked past Karin's portrait. When she organised events in Karinhol's dining rooms, she organised them in a house named for another woman. Whether she found this oppressive or simply a fact of life that she had long since made her peace with, we cannot know. But it was part of the specific texture of her daily existence in a way that distinguishes her situation from that of most women who marry widowers. Another dimension of Emmy's daily life that deserves attention is her relationship with the domestic staff of the various Göring residences. In a household as large and as complex as Karinhol, the domestic staff was a significant and important presence, and the relationship between the mistress of the house and the people who served it was a daily reality that shaped the texture of life there in important ways. Emmy had been managing a theatrical career, not a large household, before her marriage to Göring, and the transition to overseeing a staff of dozens must have required a significant expansion of her managerial capacities. She managed it well by all accounts, and seems to have been regarded by the household staff with the same combination of respect and affection that she cultivated in her social equals. The domestic staff at Harrenhal included people of various nationalities and circumstances. Some were German professionals experienced in the management of large households and employed at the high wages that the Göring wealth could sustain. Others, as the war progressed and Germany's labour pool was increasingly depleted by military mobilisation, were foreign workers whose presence in the Reich was the result of the forced labour programmes that were one of the Nazi regime's most extensive crimes. The use of forced labour in private households, while less visible and less extreme than its use in industrial settings or in the concentration camp system, was nonetheless part of the same criminal structure, and its presence at Harrenhal was another manifestation of the way in which the fruits of the Nazi system's exploitation reached directly into Emmy's daily domestic life. Did Emmy think about the circumstances of the foreign workers who served at Harrenhal? Did she make distinctions in her treatment of voluntary German staff and involuntary foreign workers? Did she consider the position of the people who were making her bed and serving her dinner as a moral question, or simply as a practical one? Again, the historical record cannot answer these questions with certainty. What it can say is that Emmy's daily comfort depended, as did that of the Nazi elite generally, on a labour system that had at its base the coercion and exploitation of millions of people from across occupied Europe, and that Emmy benefited from this system every day without any apparent effort to question or resist it. The question of what Emmy Göring actually knew about the Holocaust itself is one that historians have debated, and that will probably never be fully resolved. The Nazi regime maintained a degree of operational secrecy around its most extreme crimes, particularly the mass murder of European Jews in the extermination camps of Poland, and the deliberate compartmentalization of information about these operations was a characteristic feature of how the system worked. Senior officials like Göring knew the broad outlines, at minimum, of what was happening, and the documented evidence suggests that Göring knew considerably more than the broad outlines. But the regime did not broadcast the details of the murder operations to the wives of its leaders, any more than it broadcast them to the German public generally. What Emmy would have known with certainty is that Jews were being persecuted, dispossessed, and deported. She lived at the centre of the regime that was doing all of this, and the broad facts were not secret. The legal measures, the Nuremberg laws, the Kristallnacht pogrom, the deportations that were visible in German cities from 1941 onward, none of these were hidden from the German public, and Emmy was not an ordinary member of the public but someone at the very heart of the system. What she did not necessarily know, and what the evidence does not clearly establish that she knew, were the specific details of the extermination operations at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and the other camps. Whether she made any effort to find out what was happening to the Jews who were being deported is a different question, and the answer that her behaviour implies is that she did not. Emmy's relationship with Jewish artists and performers from her theatrical career is one of the more humanly interesting aspects of her biography. She had worked alongside Jewish colleagues for 20 years in the German theatre, in an era when Jewish participation in German cultural life was deep and pervasive. These were not abstractions to her, not a category of people defined by ideology. They were specific individuals, directors she had worked with, fellow actors she had known, musicians she had admired, impresarios who had given her opportunities. When the Nazi regime began systematically excluding Jews from cultural life in 1933 and subsequently stripping them of their citizenship, property, and eventually their lives, it was people Emmy had known personally who were being targeted. The evidence suggests, as we have noted, that Emmy occasionally used her position to try to help specific individuals. The scale and effectiveness of these interventions is difficult to assess, but they appear to have been real in at least some cases. Jewish colleagues who appealed to Emmy for help, or whose cases came to her attention through mutual acquaintances, sometimes found that an intervention with Göring was forthcoming. Göring himself issued various exemptions for specific individuals, for reasons ranging from genuine sentiment to political calculation, and Emmy's intercessions were a factor in some of these. But the contrast between these individual acts of mercy and the systematic destruction that was proceeding around them is so stark that it is difficult to make much of the mercy without losing sight of the context. One final aspect of Emmy's story that deserves attention is the question of what kind of model she provided for her daughter Edda, who grew up watching her mother navigate the extraordinary circumstances of their lives before and after the war. Emmy Göring was born into the highest luxury the Nazi regime could provide. Photographed as a baby, being admired by senior Nazi officials, raised at Karen Hall surrounded by stolen art and attended by servants, given Lucas Cranach paintings as birth gifts, and then, at the age of 7, had her entire world collapse around her. She watched her mother go through detention, legal proceedings, imprisonment, and the reconstruction of a drastically reduced life. And she absorbed from her mother a particular approach to the past that prioritized personal loyalty over public reckoning, the memory of family love over the historical evidence of family crime. Edda's maintenance throughout her adult life of her conviction that her father had been a good man and that history had treated him unfairly is a direct reflection of the values and perspectives that Emmy modeled for her. Emmy never told her daughter that Hermann Göring was a war criminal who deserved his conviction and sentence. She told her daughter that her father was a man who had been misrepresented, that the full picture was more complicated than the official verdict, that personal love was the truest form of knowledge about a person. These were the lessons that Edda learned, and she carried them until her own death in 2018, 70 years after her father died in his cell at Nuremberg. The transmission of Emmy's version of reality to her daughter was itself a kind of daily activity, sustained over the decades of the post-war years, and it is in some ways the most lasting consequence of what Emmy Göring actually did all day. The story of Emmy Göring is, in the end, a story about the specific texture of complicity, about the way in which the most intimate and domestic aspects of human life can be bound up with the most catastrophic public crimes. She was a hostess and a mother, a wife and an actress, a woman who organized dinner parties and managed a large household, and spent pleasant afternoons in the company of some of the finest paintings in the world. She was also, and simultaneously, a central figure in the social world of a regime that murdered millions of people and looted the cultural heritage of an entire civilization. These two things were not separate facts about two different people. They were the same facts about the same person. And that simultaneity is what makes Emmy Göring's story both historically important and humanly disturbing in the specific way that distinguishes it from stories of simple villainy. Simple villains are easier to deal with. They are easier to condemn, easier to categorize, easier to learn from in the straightforward sense of recognizing what we need to guard against. Emmy Göring's story is harder because she was not a simple villain. She was a person who loved and was loved, who appreciated beauty and created beautiful social environments, who felt warmth for individuals even while participating in a system that was systematically destroying people on an industrial scale. She found ways to maintain these two aspects of her existence simultaneously, and the strategies she used to do so, the selective attention, the compartmentalization, the focus on the personal and the beautiful over the historical and the moral, are strategies that are not unique to her and not unique to the specific historical circumstances of the Third Reich. They are strategies that humans use in various circumstances to remain comfortable in situations that should make them uncomfortable, and understanding how Emmy deployed them is part of understanding how ordinary human beings participate in extraordinary evil.